This lecture is about how women responded to the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the intense labor exploitation that came with it. Women responded in various ways. Many joined the progressive movement and fought for government regulation of the worst abuses of capitalism, think child labor. And many became very active in the labor movement and became socialists or anarchists. So the big ideas here are one, the rise of industrial capitalism transformed women's labor. Increasingly, women went to work in factories, which had contradictory results. It gave them, to some extent, more independence from the family, while increasing their exploitation by and dependence on male employers. Two, the rise of industrial capitalism sparked massive immigration to the US, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Asia and Latin America. And immigration was, of course, shaped by gender. Three, uh, lastly, with capitalism came increased poverty and exploitation and growing income inequality, and the result was class warfare. As working class women participated in the labor movement in large numbers, both as participants and as leaders. They also looked for alternatives to capitalism and became attracted to socialism and anarchism. But first, what is capitalism? So, here's the definition of capitalism. It's an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of the means of production rather than public ownership by government or capital held communally by the people. And what I mean by means of production is the ownership of factories, workplaces. So capitalism is driven by the pursuit of profit, which entails hiring workers in exchange for wages. And of course, goods are sold on the free market. Now, what is industrial capitalism and how did it transform life and labor? Um, so, the mass production of goods as a result of mechanization or the increased use of machinery in factories helped to spur the growth of industrial capitalism. So rather than an economy organized around households and plantation slavery, we increasingly get the growth of factories and assembly lines, which increase production, but increasingly we also get the concentration of wealth and income in fewer and fewer hands, which results in an increase in poverty and the exploitation of working people. So, over the course of the 1800s, people are increasingly living in the city as well, either by abandoning their farms in search of work or immigrating directly to the city from abroad. In 1790, the entire country claimed only 24 towns or cities with populations greater than 2,500 and none greater than 50,000. But by 1920, over half of the population lived in the cities. So how did the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century begin to transform women's lives and how they labored? For the first time, white women workers began to leave the household to work for wages in larger numbers. To understand this, we have to look for a second at what women's labor looked like prior to the rise of industrial capitalism, beginning in the mid 19th century. So, what did the US look like before the rise of industrial capitalism? Well, in the early 1800s, there's of course slavery, but what are other working people doing to make a living? In the early to mid 1800s, a household economy organized labor and production in New England and elsewhere. In this system, the home was a workplace, and the members of the nuclear family, wife, husband, and children, depended on one another for economic survival. Most non-black people lived and worked on farms. They did not work for somebody else for wages. They lived in rural areas and not in cities. In 1820, 3/4 of the labor force worked in agriculture. But the expansion of industrial capitalism leads to a huge expansion of wage labor and transforms how people labor. By 1860, over 40% of people were employed outside of agriculture. In other words, from just over 25% to 40%. That's a big shift. In the first decades of the 19th century, the rise of industrial capitalism was made possible by improvements in transportation, in canals, roads, and railroads, as well as the use of machines. Women's lives are also transformed by capitalism. In fact, young native-born white women in the 1830s and 1840s were some of the earliest factory workers. With the rise of the cotton textile industry, some of the first factories in New England in the years between 1820 and 1860, large numbers of young women left their farms to work in the expanding cotton mill towns. So how were textiles or cloth made before the growth of textile factories? As late as 1820, women working in their homes made two-thirds of all clothing produced in the United States, primarily for home consumption. Between 1820 and 1860, there was a huge demographic shift in New England, with women moving from country farms to towns and cities to work primarily in textile factories. And by 1860, there were 60,000 women working in the textile industry in New England. So what made industrialization possible? Again, it's mechanization, the growing use of machines, invention of machines, and also the textile factories grew because of the spectacular growth of the slavery-based plantation economy in the 1800s, which was very heavily based on the planting and cultivation of cotton. So without cotton grown by slaves in the South, you couldn't see the rise of these textile factories in early industrial capitalism. So the expansion of industrial capitalism was the main driving force for massive immigration to the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This period of immigration is known as the Second Great Wave of Migration, which lasted from 1880 to 1920. The first wave was from 1830 to 1860, and the third wave, Great Wave, was from 1965 to the present. This immigration was part of a larger global phenomenon, so the movement of workers, capital, and technology across national boundaries or borders to enable entrepreneurs to exploit natural resources in increasingly more parts of the world. So globally, peasants who had formerly grown food mainly for subsistence, due to increasing concentration of land in fewer hands, were dislocated from the land, and thus they were looking for ways to make a living. The question we might ask is this: so how could so many immigrants come to the U.S.? What laws existed regulating immigration? For much of this history we're discussing, there were actually no laws limiting immigration. In other words, when most Europeans immigrated to the U.S., we had open borders and people could immigrate freely. As we'll see, we only start to see the birth of an immigration system to limit immigration, increasingly in small steps in the late 19th century, and then more by the early 20th century. But where did immigrants come from? So immigrants, of course, came to the United States to work. We have immigrants from Asia. During the second half of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, almost 1 million people from China, Japan, and the Philippines immigrated to the United States and Hawaii. By contrast, about 35 million immigrants came to the U.S. between 1850 and 1930. It's quite a contrast. So the vast majority of immigrants from Asia were men, though some women did immigrate, many of whom were forced into prostitution in San Francisco and elsewhere, particularly Chinese female immigrants. So once European Americans started settling in the West in larger numbers in the late 19th century, there was a racist backlash against Asian immigration. In California, the anti-Chinese movement in particular was quite large and extremely violent, and it culminated in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first time that race had been used to totally exclude an entire group of people from the United States. So about 30 to 35 million European immigrants came to the United States between 1850 and 1930. In the mid 19th century, European immigrants came mainly from Ireland, Germany, and Great Britain. But by the late 19th century and first decades of the 20th century, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe immigrated to the U.S. in huge numbers. The peak of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe occurred between 1900 and 1920, when 13 million people immigrated. They were mainly from Italy, and Eastern Europeans, most prominently Jews, were fleeing persecution and violence, the pogroms of Eastern Europe. These quote-unquote new European immigrants faced widespread discrimination. Native-born white Americans often described Europeans from Eastern and Southern Europe as people from a lower level of civilization. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Russia, Italy, Poland, etc., Jews prominently, were viewed as dark peoples from alien cultures, and they were increasingly replacing the older, whiter European immigrants from Northern Europe. But unlike immigrants from Asia or Africa, most could at least claim citizenship through naturalization if they chose to. There was a law in place that said non-white immigrants didn't have the right to citizenship. So there's also an uptick in Mexican immigration in the early 20th century, and this was due in large part to the revolutionary violence of the Mexican Revolution. Between 1900 and 1930, approximately 1 million Mexicans immigrated to the United States. The Mexican Revolution of the 1910s or 19 teens was a major push factor for immigration from Mexico to the U.S., and most Mexican immigrants ended up in the Southwest, working in a variety of industries. The copper mines of New Mexico, the fields of California and Texas, in various kinds of factories, including canning factories, and so on. In the 1920s, there was a massive, let me see one second. Okay, this is out of order. Okay. In the 1920s, there was a massive anti-immigrant movement that sought to cut off the massive flow of immigrants from this huge flow of immigrants from around the world. The nativists, as the anti-immigrant activists were known, used racist arguments to demand that the so-called less desirable immigrants be prohibited from immigrating. The 1920s also saw the renewed popularity of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a racist terrorist organization founded after the Civil War, which by the 1920s was also targeting immigrants as well as African Americans, Mexicans, and other people of color. The nativist movement succeeded in passing the Immigration Act of 1924, which birthed a new immigration system based on racial quotas that would regulate immigration for the next 40 years. So Asian immigration was cut off almost in its entirety, and the less desirable immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were limited to a fraction of the previous numbers. The supposedly more desirable immigrants, the lighter-skinned and fairer immigrants from Northern Europe, were given a much larger quota than any other immigrant group during this period. Okay, let's go back a couple. So, let's talk about gender. Did women and men immigrate in similar numbers? The trend more recently is that women actually slightly outnumber men immigrating to the U.S., but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women generally comprised between 30 to 35% of immigrants. Why was this? So it was often the case that men migrated to the U.S. and elsewhere to work and attempt to save money to send money back home, and in the meantime, women stayed home and cared for the family and often farmed. So this is why you see a larger number of men immigrating. The exception is for Jewish immigrants. They were refugees from anti-Semitic violence, so anti-Jewish violence. And because of this, they tended to be more evenly divided between men and women than other immigrant groups, and they tended to arrive as families. So more Jewish women immigrated. So Americans viewed independent female migration as a moral problem in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Women were supposed to be naturally dependent on men. So if they immigrated alone, they might be questioned as potential prostitutes or as a potential public charge. Chinese women immigrating through Angel Island off the West Coast tended to undergo more extensive questioning than other immigrants because they were suspected of being prostitutes. In fact, prostitutes were explicitly excluded from immigrating after the passage of the Page Act of 1875. So it's important to acknowledge that women and men, though they shared many experiences in common, also had very distinct experiences due to their gender. Women were often the carriers of culture in families generally, and this was, of course, also the case for immigrant families. And immigrant women worked in various industries. So they worked in textiles, in garment factories, canneries. Many worked in agriculture, domestic service, as well as in prostitution. Whereas native-born white women were much more likely to work in positions like as clerks, typists, secretaries, and so on. So immigrant women who worked in factories like men, but they did different kinds of labor within these factories, and they were paid about half of what men were paid. They also were responsible for the double day. So once they got home after working in the factory, they had to do all of the labor of the household, the cooking, laundry, taking care of the children, other family members. And during this period in time, keeping infants alive was actually quite hard work. In New York, as many as a quarter of all babies died in their first 2 years, usually as a result of spoiled food or milk during the summer months. Okay, I'll pause there.